Hey everyone, it's Brett at Hope to Prosper. I'm up at the top of Ontario Peak today. It's about almost 8,700 feet. Let's see if we can get in here. Almost 8,700 feet. You can see how high we are above the valley. Anyways, I'm starting my talk for my video at the top of the peak instead of the bottom. And for good reason, I didn't know if I'd make it up here or not. So now I can brag a little bit and start my video at the summit. So anyways, all the footage is going up, but that's okay. So I'm here on another adventure, bringing you with me. And once again, talking about early retirement and some of my adventures. So thank you guys for coming along. I really appreciate you. Can't even tell you how much. So is the 4% rule obsolete? It's a grand question. And I want you to know that I didn't create this article for clickbait or for some kind of a fake controversy. I want everyone to know that I struggle with the 4% rule. And as you know, if you followed my videos, that I chose the 5% rule instead. And one of the reasons I wanted to make this article was because I was literally depressed because I didn't think I had enough money to retire. I was just a little bit short. And having gone from the 4% rule from Bill Bengen to the 5% rule, guidance guardrails, allowed me to retire, whereas I was not going to be able to retire or withdraw the amount of money I really needed for my retirement and my health care at 4%. So it's a valid question for me. In fact, it's something that really affected my early decisions. You know, I thought the 4% rule was pretty much cast in stone, and I just thought I had come up short. I wasn't there. I couldn't do it. And as I researched it more and more, I began to question whether, 4% was the right number. And I'm glad I chose 5% and moved on, because that allowed me to retire where 4% wouldn't have. So let's kind of start at the beginning. The 4% rule, it's kind of been the gold standard, the baseline, whatever you want to call it, for millions of retirees. Not only retirees, but financial planners use it. The FIRE community all uses it. It's kind of like the sacred cow of retirement ratios. So everybody thinks 4% rule is great, and I understand why. It's conservative. It's kind of foolproof, and it's a simple rule of thumb. Everybody wants a rule of thumb. Just, what's a number? Okay, I got it. Or, nope, that number don't work. And so for those reasons, I can understand why the 4% rule has been adopted so heavily. But there are some issues with it, some issues I have with it, and that I want to specifically address for everyone else. So first of all, the 4% rule was created by Bill Bengen in 1994. Most people know that. And he did a study on a 50-year period of time from 1926 to 1976, where he was trying to determine what a safe withdrawal rate was in retirement. And, I give him a lot of congratulations for that, because that's something that's been super useful for everyone. I was watching, so this post came about by two things. First of all, I was watching an interview on YouTube with Bill Bengen, and one of the things that he's revised it a couple times, first of all, it's not 4%, it's 4.17% or something like that. It's slightly over 4%. But he revised it up to 4.5%, and now he said with specific changes to the portfolio, it could go as high as 4.8%, which I take it as, rounding up to 5. And so I think I agree with Bill Bengen more on the 5% than the 4%. So let's talk about what's under the hood and what makes this this ratio, this simple ratio, more complicated than people believe. First of all, what most people don't know is that Bill Bengen calculated the 4% rule based on a 50% large cap stocks and 50% cash or cash equivalents. So it's not like a typical retirement portfolio you would see, which is 60% stocks, 40% bonds. it's super ultra conservative. Nowadays people don't invest in Dow stocks as much as they invest in, say, the NASDAQ or the S&P 500. So the return ratio, when you go to a mix of full stock index, which is what Bill Bengen used to come up with 4.8%, is more, realistic, or it's more, it's more like what people would invest today. So that's the first thing about it. The second thing is right now you could get 5% plus in a money market or a high interest savings account. So what's to stop people from just putting 5%, putting it in a 5%, investment, liquid investment, taking out 5%, and then just your principal would never shrink. So you could take 5% and never worry about your portfolio going down at all, ever. Will the 5% money market last? I don't know. I don't know the future. But I do know for right now, what's to stop people from just putting it in a high yield savings account and taking out 5% every year? That's another 20% to retire on. And you never have to worry about your nest egg dying. So that's something to think about. So for those two reasons, I wanted to talk about, is it obsolete? And I think, there are a number of things that need to be considered. So first of all, the 4% rule, is it too conservative? That's the first question. It's based on worst case scenario. Even Bill Bengen himself has said that, there are times when you could withdraw 7% or 13%. And have a safe retirement. But, nobody knows the future, so 4% is it's the bottom line, let's call it that. And so my first question is it too conservative? I chose 5%. I feel pretty confident with that. Over the last decade or two, I've averaged about 9 to 10% on my investments. So pulling out 5 really isn't a problem. That covers my expenses in retirement. It also covers inflation to a large extent. And that's another thing I want to bring up about the 4% rule, is inflation as a factor, right? Bill Bengen said that one of the biggest threats to his 4% rule is high inflation. If you had a sustained period of high inflation, you might not go broke, but boy, your expenses would definitely go way up, and we all experience that, so we know how that works. And so high inflation could be a problem. If we ever go back to hyperinflation like we had in the 80s, this 4% rule wouldn't cover your expenses very well, and if you did take the inflation adjustments up, it would eat up your portfolio pretty quick. So inflation's a big factor. And then my biggest problem with it is that it's static instead of dynamic. In other words, it doesn't adjust. So you're sitting there, and the good news is you could look out 30 years and say, hey, I could take this 40% for 30 years or 25 years and never have to worry about it. That's the good news. The bad news is, as the market goes up and down, as inflation goes up and down, all your inputs are changing, but your withdrawal is really not. So is that a smart strategy? Are you better off with something like Guyton's guardrails or the ratcheting rule, or something that looks at your portfolio and adjusts? I'm a proponent of dynamic versus static. It's great to say, okay, I can take this much out for 25 years, but the reality is all the inputs change daily or if not yearly, and so taking out a static amount seems antiquated to me. I think there has to be something that's much more dynamic. And yes, it's harder to predict on a dynamic number versus a static number, but I just think it's a lot more realistic. The final thing I want to bring up, the final thing I have against the 4% rule is optimizing and enjoying your retirement. Are you living on 4% in the next 25, 30 years, and then you're going to die with all this money? Whereas if you used a different rule, something that's more dynamic or more realistic, let's just call it, could you just have a better retirement? Could you enjoy your retirement a lot more with more money? I think that's a pretty simple question. If there's a way to retire more, withdraw more, like in my case, an extra percent, boy, what a big difference that makes in your retirement versus living on a pretty stringent budget of just 4%. If you have $1 million, that's the difference between $40,000 and $50,000 a year. And that's the difference between maybe a nice vacation or a newer car or whatever. So optimizing your retirement is another big factor. And I think that the 4% rule probably just might be causing some people to live not in poverty, but, a much more frugal retirement than they would need. Nobody knows what the stock market is going to do in the future, and nobody knows, what inflation's going to do, what the Fed's going to do. You just can't predict those things. But in my opinion, I think there has to be a better way to calculate retirement withdrawal rate than the 4% rule. I do believe it was a great idea in the 90s, and it was a great starting point. But I think developing something newer, like, maybe updating guidance guardrails. I don't know about the ratcheting rule so much because it never goes back down, which I think is a problem. But I think something that's more static is the future of calculating retirement withdrawal rates. So feel free to disagree with me in the comments or provide your input. But that's my opinion. I think we need at least guidance guardrails or some updated version of that to successfully plan. Okay, so that's all I have for you today. That's all I have for now. Thanks for coming by. I want to thank everyone who likes and subscribes to my channel, and I appreciate your comments. I enjoy them. And I just want to wish you all health, happiness, and prosperity in your lives. And I will see you next week on our next adventure.